It's hot. It's midday. It's 38 degrees. Only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. Well, I'm not English, but maybe I'm a mad dog. So what do we want to talk about today? Well, I'm interested in the concept of a mixed economy. Because there are three types of economic models. Doesn't matter what period in human history, there are three types. And currently, during the deregulation, corporatisation, globalisation, privatised revolution, which the world has experienced in the last half a century, the private investment for the private profit model is king. And now obviously, in the past, we've had many societies which have functioned on the private investment for private profit model. And what we saw, if we concentrate, say, on areas we're familiar with, like Western Europe, what we saw when the private investment for private profit model was king, poverty was widespread, the amount of resources which went back to the general population was minimal. Starvation, disease accompanied it. And during the 19th and early part of the 20th century, we had the period of reform and revolutionary change, where people were actually able to wrest some power from those who championed the private investment for private profit model. I'll just give you an example. In, I think it was about 1820, 1825, when Governor Macquarie was the Governor of New South Wales. He replaced the Bligh, who'd been deposed by his own military officers here in Sydney, the new penal colony. Macquarie started off using convict labour, which was the majority of the population, to build public buildings. This was a period of great expansion as far as building was concerned during that period. But by the end of his tenure, we saw the rich squatters demand and receive free convict labour. So here we have a private investment for private profit model trumping a public model. So I said before, there are three models. There's the private investment for private profit. There's the public model, which was all the rage in the 19th century, especially in sovereign nation states which described themselves as communist, where the government owned the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And theoretically, the people, the proletariat, owned the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. But the reality was very different. Again, we had a monopoly. We had a public monopoly. There was no competition. Now, in Australia, we have an Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, and its function is to ensure, through legislation and the courts, that the large corporations compete. But the reality is very different. There is no competition in a private investment for private profit model, because the maximum is to improve return to investors and shareholders. So that is the only thing that a private investment for private profit model has. There's no such thing as a reform capitalism. There's no such thing as a people public friendly capitalism. Capitalism is about private investment for private profit. And during the last 50 years, we've seen what happens when this occurs, when it dominates the economy. We've seen it with the NDIS, that's the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We've seen it in the private health sector, with the destruction of Medicare. We see it in the public education sector and the private education sector, where public resources are directed to the private education sector. We see it in the health sector, where private insurance company, a are basically kept in business through taxation subsidies. So the private investment for private profit model is very good for a small percentage of the population. It's exceptionally good for the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And we have seen this happen in this country in the last 30 to 40 years. It's also good for the investment class, that 8% of Australians who have enough disposable income to take advantage of successive government's investment-friendly policies like negative gearing, dividend imputation if you own shares. So you get a tax deduction for owning shares, you get a tax deduction for owning a second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th home. So that's the private investment for private profit model. The problem is when you have a monopoly. When you have a public monopoly or a private monopoly. With a private monopoly you have corporations and individuals skimming off most of the profits, and in a public monopoly you have the bureaucrats and the particular government that is in power at that particular point in time getting the major benefits of that monopoly, because there is no competition, there is no real competition. Now you wouldn't need an Australian Competition and Consumer Commission if there was competition in a private investment for private profit model. And the best way to get rich is to start up a new business and hopefully it's taken over by some corporation, which happens constantly. So I've spoken about two models: public monopolies, private monopolies. So what is a mixed economy? Is a mixed economy competition between private and public, or is there a third player? And that's what I'm interested in talking about today. A third player which is non-existent in Australian society. Well, almost non-existent. There are remnants left. And that third player is the cooperative and collectivist sector. And nobody gets rich working in a cooperative or a collective. But that type of work ensures that people's basic necessities are met. They can do a little bit of saving, and they have stability of employment. While the cooperative or collective continues to exist, they have stability of employment and income. And the dilemma in a private investment for private profit model is you do not have security of employment, and even in a public model there are issues regarding security of employment if you buck the system. So in a mixed economy you should have three different types of economy competing simultaneously in the same locality. And that's the private sector, the public sector and the cooperative sector. I'll give you an example. When the Commonwealth Bank was owned by the government of the day, not the people, because it was sold by the government of the day. When the Commonwealth Bank was owned by the government of the day, there was competition between the private financial sector and the public financial sector. As soon as the Commonwealth Bank was privatised, not only was revenue lost for the Treasury, but what we saw is competition disappear. Anybody who goes into a privately owned financial institution understands that ultimately there is little competition. It's a little bit like buying petrol or gas in the private sector. As a consumer, there's little competition, and you see that day in and day out. But if a mixed economy is a three-level economy, a three-tier economy, you've got the private sector, which basically is involved in providing services which are not essential for survival. You have the public sector, which is involved in providing services for essential items. And you have the cooperative sector, which is involved in providing gainful employment and income, secure income, to a significant proportion of the population. That is what is called a mixed economy. That is a mixed economy, where the three different type of economic forces compete against each other to provide goods and services to the population as a whole. So let's look at the Australian experience. In the past, at the end of the 19th century, we had a growing collective and cooperative sector. We had mutual aid societies which came together to provide services to their members who paid for membership. And even today, while most mutual aid services, including the Australian Mutual Provident Fund, AMP, which was mutual aid, have been demutualised, we find that there are still vestiges of that cooperative sector. RACV, the Royal Automobile Club of Victoria, was never demutualised. It continues to function. Coughing. It's the heat. I think I swallowed a fly, but that's the price you pay for living in the country. So getting back, there was a history of mutual organisations. There was a history of cooperatives and collectives. And the first thing that happened with deregulation, especially in the primary production, is we saw cooperatives and collectives which have been set up by primary producers to ensure people got a return for their effort were privatised. And we saw agribusiness take over the agricultural sector, large swathes for the agricultural sector. We saw that with water. When water was privatised, and now we have a market for an essential commodity like water, which can be bought and sold and traded. So what we saw during the 20th century, especially the latter half of the 20th century, is the demutualisation. That's the breakup of mutual aid. So demutualisation may have provided a few dollars for the people who voted to demutualise their mutual organisations, but ultimately it has cost people a lot of money. So in Australia there are no cooperatives and collectives. You go to a bank or a financial institution and ask money to set up a cooperative and collective, and they'll laugh you out of the bank. It doesn't fit their economic model. So how do we begin? How do we build up the cooperative and collective sector? We do that by 1% of superannuation funds being set aside to provide start-up capital for cooperatives and collectives. Now some will fail, the majority will succeed, and in the end returns greater than what has been lent out will be returned to the superannuation funds. Just 1%. We could see thousands of cooperatives and collectives and mutual aid societies set up around this country, not only providing essential goods and services at a reasonable price because they are competing against the private sector, but also providing gainful, long-term, secure employment for hundreds of thousands of people. We see this to some degree in some countries around the world, but not many. And what about the public sector? It was laughable to see the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Albanese, talk about the pharmaceutical benefits scheme and the shortages which we are currently experiencing. And instead of Australia setting up a publicly owned pharmaceutical industry which provides essential products to the population at large, he was talking about providing subsidies and money to large, multinational, transnational pharmaceutical corporations. We saw this with the AstraZeneca COVID-19 injection, when the government bet on the wrong horse and over $1 billion went to the private sector for no return. So why should we continue to subsidise the private sector? People talk about social security welfare and they talk about social security fraud. The fact is, the biggest fraud that exists in this country is corporate fraud. Whether it's early childhood development, whether it's the National Disability Insurance Scheme, whether it's private health, whether it's aged care, and the list goes on. And the fact that we continue to provide subsidies to mining companies that are making billions of dollars of profits is just extraordinary. So, we should be developing publicly owned facilities which provide essential services to the population at large. We had them 50 years ago. We had them as far as pharmaceuticals were concerned with the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, which was established in 1911, privatised in 1992 by Mr. Keating. We had publicly owned electricity and gas, and we wouldn't have the problems we have today. We had publicly owned businesses, and the list goes on. So what we need to see in this country is the growth of a mixed economy. We need to shrink the private investment for private profit sector. We need to grow the public sector to provide essential services, and we need to provide a funding base, start-up funding for cooperatives and collectives. If we don't, we'll continue to have private charities raising money to send Australian kids to what are publicly owned schools. We'll continue to have extensive waiting lists in the public health sector. We'll continue to have a bureaucracy that is not able to cope because it's underfunded and under-resources, and the list goes on. So we do have options. Human beings have always had options. What options they pursue are to a significant degree determined by those who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the amount of resistance there is to monopolisation, to monopolies, whether they're public monopolies or private monopolies in the country. So if you want change, we need to make urgent reforms regarding the introduction of a real mixed economy in this country, which will create real competitive forces, which will be good ultimately for every person living in Australia. If you're interested in these concepts, I encourage you to join Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. Go to PIBCI, pibci.net. You can join online. If you can't join online, give us a call, 0439 395 489, and we'll sort it out for you.